episode of Why Would No Date These Guys with Naomi Guy and
Joel Guy.
Oh, he sounds so sad. Are you okay?
I don't know, man. Just, having one of them days. Which, unfortunately, is more and more days these days. You know what I'm saying?
Joel.
It's like, you know how Arizona has over 100 days each year that are over 100 degrees? And over time, that's just going to trend higher and higher.
Yeah.
Having more of those days that are the days. You know what I'm saying?
Sadly, I do.
Naomi, today I want to share something special with you.
Is it Japanese pineapple soda?
It is Japanese pineapple soda, whose name we can't read because this bottle is in Japanese. It says 1982 and then some kaiji.
What if it was made in 1982?
Oh, it smells really good.
Okay, let's drink it then.
Before we drink it, Naomi, we are a podcast. We talk about sex and stuff. This is part 2. If you didn't listen to part 1, what are you doing with yourself?
Yeah, go back. If you haven't read the labels yet, you're doing something wrong.
Okay, here's something that is weird.
Yeah.
We did a 2-parter episode with our aunt that we published a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And according to the listening data, more people have downloaded the second part of the first part. And I'm like, do you think you're going to get something? The descriptions are different. The descriptions are like, part 2, we're going to talk more about drugs.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why. But let's drink some Japanese pineapple soda.
It kind of looks like toxic waste.
Oh, I like it. This would be good vanilla ice cream.
I don't like it.
Oh, it's so good.
No, I don't like it.
It's like sickly sweet, and I probably couldn't finish a whole bottle, but it's like a hard pineapple candy in soda form.
Yeah, that's exactly what it tastes like.
But it would be good with vanilla ice cream.
The aftertaste is very...
I'm going to go buy a bunch of vanilla ice cream.
pineapple-y. We have no room in our freezer.
I took out the frozen salmon that's been sitting in there for 4 years.
You're really just letting our listeners in on the details of our everyday life. Yeah, we've had some. If any of our listeners want some ham, let us know.
Yeah, we got a big ham that's been sitting in the freezer back when I was still eating meat. God, it might be 6 years old. Who can say? Who
Ew.
can say?
That and then
Now, I just really want to build up these parasocial relationships our listeners are experiencing. All these people who are like, I'm a friend of the guys because I listen to their episodes and know that Joel's weird and that Naomi sometimes puts streaks of dye in her hair.
that hasn't happened in like 2 years. I haven't done that. I haven't done that since I moved in here.
Exactly, and that's why it's a parasocial relationship, because they think they understand us, but really we're complicated. Me, this isn't even my normal accent. My normal accent is something like this.
Did I tell you that when I went to San Francisco, I saw your friend and she listens to our podcast and she was like, oh my God, I know everything about your life. I've met this girl like twice now. She's like, oh my God, I know everything about your life. And I was like, I feel so awkward because you know everything about my life and I know nothing about yours.
She lives in a fancy house.
She does.
Let's give all the details necessary to mug our friend. Whose name I have to now bleep out. God,
twice now.
Twice now. Naomi, how are you celebrating 2020 Too Much Fun?
Well, today Joel and I went on a siblings date. We got some coffee with our parents and then we went to Marshall's after going to the restaurant supply store, in which he bought me pepper jack macaroni and cheese bites, which I'm very excited to throw in the oven and eat.
I am somewhat seriously concerned of rising food prices, because boy, this world, the older generations are really giving us a legs up.
Yeah.
But yeah, restaurant supply stores, if there's one in your area, check them out. A lot of them are open to the public, and if they're only open to businesses, registering as a business is really, really easy. But yeah, typically they sell food in bulk for really cheap prices, for cheaper than Costco in a lot of situations. And if you have a hankering for like, I don't know, a 5-pound bag of mozzarella sticks, they'll sell it to you.
I mean, it's not as pretty, but it definitely gets the job done.
This is 100% true. And then also it's a really good place for produce. If you need like a bunch of citrus, it's a great place to buy that.
Or 50 pounds of carrots.
I buy 3-pound bags of spinach and then cook them all at once to make Korean banchan. And that's my form of self-care, Korean food.
Is that how you've been doing your 20 Too Much Fun? Dang it,
I have been cooking a lot more Korean food. That was something I wanted to get better at. One thing I was planning to get better at that I need to get back on the bandwagon on, but someone moved my rice maker, so I keep forgetting where it is getting really good at Japanese sushi rice and then making more sushi.
Okay.
It used to be, when I worked at a poke restaurant, I had perfect Japanese sushi rice done, but that was 55 servings at a time, and the proportions and the equipment is much different in a home environment.
To build up the parasocial relationship that we have with our audience, I would like to say that
I love all of you. I care so much. You mean the world to me.
I reorganized the kitchen after our roommate left he moved out of the house. And so I decided that I was going to take it upon myself to reorganize the kitchen so that we had more space for food storage. Because Joel likes to fill everything to the brim and then fill it some more. So I organized the kitchen, and I was like, the next person that moves in here will have so much cabinet space. I moved everything literally a shelf down, and Joel is simply just confused to the point where he can't find anything.
You might have
and
lived in
blames
this house
me.
for like 5+ years.
Yeah, and
so
it doesn't
changes,
flow. It doesn't flow. This kitchen doesn't flow at all.
And yet we're still going to open that cabinet and expect plates to be there.
Yes, and I've been doing it for a month now.
It's disconcerting. So Naomi, this is part 2 of our 2-parter, or it could be a 3-parter. We can really push it and get into those other culture marriages.
I'm going to have to read the entire book to you if you want it.
We could do that. That could be a Naomi Alone episode.
Chapter 1.
We'll pretend Joel's in the corner and I'll just be passed out asleep. Oh, this is when we start our YouTube episodes.
No. That wouldn't be fun because we'd have to mute you because you'd literally just be snoring.
No comment. So part 2 of marriage. We learned in the first part some of the historical origins and reasons people got married. I got deeply confused. I talked about Foucault's history of sexuality. Told the secrets of life in the universe and everything. Check out part 1.
Yeah. This is part 2, where we read the book word by word. Chapter 1.
Yeah. If we wanted people to marry us, which was the original intent of the podcast, we really should have started with this.
No, it was we wanted people to date us. I don't want anyone fucking marrying me.
Disgusting.
Ew.
Hear that, Lynn?
No, he knows my views on marriage. He's okay with my views on marriage. I don't know why we talked about marriage. We've been dating.
Naomi wants a rock the size of Mars.
I want a rock bigger than Mars.
It's a tough bar to clear.
If Mars was a rock, oh wait.
Let's get to the actual content. Our listeners, oh my God, Naomi, I'm looking at the viewership numbers. They're in free fall right now.
So the formation of the concept of Western marriage and what we know marriage as today in the United States specifically.
Okay, let's get back to banter. I don't know if this is going to compel people. Go ahead.
Ultimately, none of their efforts succeeded in displacing the marriage alliance system, but its central role in politics and economics.
I'm sorry, what are we talking about? Where did we leave off?
We just explained how marriage had moved from connection to consolidating wealth, and then we talked about its connection to purity culture. So now we're talking about the formation of Western marriage and what we know marriage as today.
Okay.
Yes. So, but 3 attempts to curtail aristocratic family power eventually had particular significance for the development of marriage in Western Europe. The first was the establishment of democracy in Athens in the 5th century BC. The second was the imposition of universal law and development of a professional army in the Roman Republic and early empire. The third came in the later days of the Roman Empire when Christianity emerged as an institution that combined a universal ideal of brotherhood with many of the trappings of state power. Would you like me to go into specifics?
No, that seems like Christianity, all right.
Okay. So now we have this idea of Western marriage, which is like you have to go and find yourself a spouse and go and get married and live long and happy together in a house that you've bought. And this is like, I'm mixing the American dream with marriage right now, aren't I?
Yeah, white picket fence in the Middle Ages.
So,
just like Jesus would have wanted.
Much like today, there was a period, this was a bit after, obviously, the Roman Empire, and I'm going to go into specifics, but one distinctive feature of Western European marriage was that as early as the 12th century, polygamy was prohibited. Many men kept mistresses, and wives were expected to ignore such behaviors. But mistresses had no legal rights or social standing. By the 15th century, the children of mistresses had lost their inheritance rights, like we talked about in the first episode, and they had in early medieval period. A man's heir had to be born in marriage. For a long time, the church had prohibited adoption. The decisive victory for the church in the battles over divorce for the 9th to the 13th century reinforced the importance of getting a fertile wife for the first time around. Men rarely, I hate that she just said that, the first time around.
No, we'll get it right round 2 or 3. That's what guys are known for.
Men rarely got a second chance to produce a male heir. Aristocrats could often win an exemption for prohibitions against divorce, and the lower classes frequently evaded the rules. But laws against divorce were far stricter than almost anywhere else. Even Eastern Europe was more lenient. Under Russian law, for example, a wife could divorce her husband if he raped her, went heavily into debt, or became a drunkard. In Western Europe, a wife had no recourse. In most cases, marriages were truly for better or for worse.
Yay.
So now we're going to talk about what happened in England between 1500 and 1700. Because
I think our audience knows. Like, why would we go over something as basic as that, Naomi?
Because it's much like what's happening today in all across the world. Marriage was in crisis. And you're going to say, I hate that I keep using that word, but that's the word that she keeps using throughout the book.
It's like a DC Comics like event where they bring together all the heroes and they're like, it's the marriage crisis. Batman didn't marry Catwoman. Superman and Lois Lane, marriage on the rocks? ? Green Arrow, Black Canary. Are they going to bring in a third to revive their stagnating marriage? I don't know if they're married in the comics or not. I haven't kept up.
Do you want?
Let me pull back the curtain a little. So,
Okay.
see audience. DC has this trend of naming all of their major like comic crossovers like blank crisis, like Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, Crisis on Infinite Worlds. So I was making a joke based off that, and then in order to substantiate the joke, like add additional like substance to it to make it seem like I wasn't rambling and like it was actually funny. I brought in some examples of like DC Comics couples. And it's frustrating that Batman can't get married because so many awkward nerd man children they look at Batman and they're like, Batman's really cool, and it's probably a bad message to send if Batman's this cool dude who can never get married, because then they're like, oh well, marriage isn't for me. I'm just gonna treat women like a billionaire playboy would and use them as disposable things. Anyways, go back to what you're talking about.
In societies where a couple is incorporated into a larger family compound or productive unit, marriage and childbearing generally take place at a young age because a couple doesn't need to be economically self-sufficient to wed. But in northwestern Europe, when a man and a woman married, they were expected to work their own land or establish their own trade rather than live in as a part of a larger family collective. Because a couple was expected to support the partners and their children, marriage had to wait until they had accumulated or inherited enough to sustain a separate household. Many guilds required journeymen and apprentices to remain single until they had passed the examination to become a master and could be assured a steady livelihood. As a result, people in northwestern Europe generally married later than elsewhere in the world. In England, between 1500 and 1700, the median age of first marriage for a woman was 26, which is higher than the median age of marriage for American women at any point during the 20th century. The age of marriage was sometimes much lower for the very wealthy, especially for aristocrats, but they had a very small minority of the population. So that's like what it is today. We're talking about consolidating. Talking about accumulating wealth in order to become married and start a household.
And it's the exact same problems where
that we're
they
having
don't have
today.
Any money
Yes.
or resources.
Yes.
They can't go, and so they have to wait.
And you have to accumulate enough wealth in order to not only sustain you and your spouse, but also possible children that you might have in the future.
Imagine if your boss played a role in your marriage and was like, I don't know, you got to learn how to fix iron tools really good before I'll let you get married.
Yeah. I can imagine that, honestly. Just sitting there and being like, well, I did it, sir, like 5 times. And he's like, no, I want you to do it better before you become a master and start a family. And he's like, but I'm 36. I've been doing this for 20 fucking years.
You got to be a master stonemason. You got to build that cathedral before we let you get married.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, the thing about cathedral making is it's the most attractive career a guy can have.
Yeah.
And so if you have to build a whole cathedral before you get married, it presents all sorts of problems where, like, ladies are coming up to you and being like, oh, why are you settling for her? You could have me. And then that just actually breaks up a lot of marriages. You would not believe. See, part of the reason, Naomi, that that marriage is on the decline is because so many cathedrals are being built these days. And it's just nonstop women throwing themselves at men, or alternatively, men throwing themselves at the few female cathedral designers out there. It's really disappointing that it's still a sexist profession. There's so few proficient female stonemasons who design cathedrals. You would not believe.
See, audience, sometimes when I don't speak, Joel just keeps going on with his lie and continues to just like add to it. So I have to like stop him mid-lie in order to get him to actually truth for a while.
And the truth is, keep going.
So around this time, around the time of the new Protestant church evolved a movement. And you ask, what is the movement? Well, we finally start to see love as a part of marriage. And love becomes a central part of marriage. And you're thinking, how did that come about? Well, what are your assumptions?
Oh, that actually was a question.
Yeah.
I really don't know, because it feels difficult to move from one to the other. My only guess would be because it took so long in order to establish yourself economically and build up the resources you needed in order to operate independently, you had a lot more discretion about who you ended up with. It's sort of the same thing I was talking about in terms of like independence with cathedral makers and people throwing themselves at them. But yeah, like I assume the longer you're in a community doing stuff and building up economic resources, the more people are going to meet and the more options you have compared to living in a very close-knit community, having fewer people to pick from and all of your relationships being dictated for economic or political influence.
So I'm going to take what you said and add to it. Okay. So the Catholic Church during this time, around the time that the Protestant Church, around the time that the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church became two churches. So when was that? Like 1560s?
Couldn't tell you.
Okay, I'm just going to say it's 1560s.
Deus Vult. That's all I retained from medieval church knowledge.
So Protestants put a huge importance on marriage as the fundamental block of society. So that is not just your relationship with God, but your relationship with your spouse is a fundamental block of society.
Well, it's
and
like
a lot
Margaret
of people
Thatcher used to say, there is no society, there's only individuals and families. She was a Protestant. I don't know if that's true.
See, that's how I actually was talking, and he continued to lie. So during this time, the Catholic Church insisted that celibacy still had to be a part of everyday life. So men, women, children all had to be celibate in order to have a proper, pure marriage. And because of that, the Protestants were like, okay, we're going to start this new sort of view on marriage. And so, like I said, Protestants in turn insisted that marriage was the fundamental building block of society. Luther argued that all creatures are divided into male and females, even trees marry. Likewise, budding plants, there is also marriage between rocks and stones. But these differences meant less in practice than in theory. The growing economic importance and political independence of the nuclear family led writers of all religious persuasions to direct more attention to relations between husbands and wives. Because marriage wasn't so important, 16th and 17th century commentators agreed, people ought to think carefully about the character as well as the wealth of the partners. The best mate was someone whose social station, temperament, values, and work ethic were similar to one's own. There should be enough love, at least mutual respect, between prospective partners to prevent quarrels that might disrupt the orderly functioning of the household. These notions seem to have spread rapidly throughout the period. Some parents even expressed sentiments that, like those of the Duchess of Suffolk, who wanted her son to marry the daughter of the Duke of Somerset, but wrote a friend in 1550 that she hoped the young couple would begin their love of themselves without forcing. More and more, the word love and marriage was used in the same sentence, and the outright idealization of adultery that had marked the courtly love poetry and popular literature of the Middle Ages became rare, whereas the medieval religious writers had used the word love to describe the relationship between men and Jesus, or the feelings that neighbors had towards one another. In the 16th century, sermons began to emphasize love between husband and wife. But the 17th century preachers were condemning husbands who governed by fear alone with an equal measure of love. The English Puritan Robert Cleaver said that the husband should not command his wife like a servant, but exert his authority in the way that would rejoice and content her. Catholic writers expressed similar sentiments, and the growing number of middle-class households in the expanding commercial economy created a large pool of families that were especially receptive to these ideas.
You're reading that, and all I'm thinking is this is the same period of like rapid city growth and like expanding urban areas, and I wonder if that played a role in how people thought about relationships and marriages. Because like before then, if you're living like by yourself on a plot of land in your thatch hut or whatever, you can scream at and beat your wife fairly easily.
Yeah.
And people can look at the marriage from the outside on the rare occasions you appear in public and be like, oh, it's such loving and doting and whatnot. But when you're in a city urban environment living very close to other people, it's much harder to cover that up. It's much harder for people to not notice all the imperfections and flaws in relationships because you're living in a thin-walled house, 150 feet at most away from other people, and suddenly they get to understand, oh no, even these relationships that look really good on the outside have all these problems within them. And so a lot of the kind of myths people constructed about, how good these relationships were dissolved, and now they have to think more critically about what it actually means to have a partnership. I don't know, that's just a thought, but that trend would seem to match up with what you're talking about. I'm going to write my own book on marriage.
No, I think you should, because this one's like, it is a history, like she said, and I think we're interpreting it as she should have all the answers, but I don't think there's a lot of good writing about all the answers that all the questions that we have.
I think that's fair, but I don't know, like the perspective she's given so far, I mean, at least maybe your interpretation of it leads me to believe that there's a certain view she cares about and she hasn't bothered investigating the others. And again, I think it's one thing to say, well, the evidence just doesn't exist. Unfortunately, there's poor documentation of like the general habits of peasants and, commoners who couldn't really write and record their experiences. And I doubt there were a lot of anthropologists of the day who were doing that for them. But it's another to just sort of completely ignore them or try to summarize it without a lot of stuff to begin with.
No, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, but towards the end of the book, she gives her explanation of why marriage is quote-unquote in crisis, and it really just pisses me off. So we'll talk more about that later, but now we want to talk about early feminists.
Should Batman have married Catwoman?
I don't know. I haven't seen the new movie yet.
Should Batman have married the Joker?
No, definitely not. That would have been awful. Especially momentous for relations between husband and wife was the weakening of the political model upon which marriage had long been based. Until the 17th century, the family was thought of as a miniature monarchy with the husband king over his dependents. As long as political absolutism remained unchallenged in society as a whole, so did the hierarchy of traditional marriage. But the new political ideals fostered by the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688 was an even more far-reaching revolution. The even more far-reaching revolutions in America and France in the last quarter of the 18th century dealt a series of cataclysmic blows to the traditional justification of patriarchal authority. In the late 17th century, John Locke argued the governmental authority was simply a contract between ruler and ruled, and that if the ruler exceeded the authority his subjects granted him, that he would be replaced. In 1698, he suggested that marriage, too, could be seen as a contract between equals. Locke still believed that men would normally rule their families because of their greater strength and ability. But another English writer, Mary Estelle, pushed Locke's theory to what she thought was the logical conclusion. If absolute sovereignty was not necessary in the state, Estelle asked, how comes it to be so in a family? She answered that not only was absolutism unnecessary within the marriage, but it was actually more mischievous in families than in kingdoms. But exactly the same amount as 10,000 tyrants are worse than one. During the 18th century, people began to focus more on the mutual obligations required in marriage, rejecting analogies between absolute rights of a husband and the absolute rights of a king. They argued that parental order should be based on love and reason, not on husband's arbitrary will. The French writer, the Marquis of Condorcet, and the mayor author Mary Wollstonecraft went so far as to call the complete equality within marriage. Only a small minority of thinkers, even in enlightened circles, endorse equality between the sexes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the most enthusiastic proponents of romantic love and harmonious marriage, also wrote that a woman should be trained to docility, for she will always be a subjection to a man or to a man's judgment, and she will be free to set her own opinion above his. She will never be free to set his own opinion above his. The German philosopher J.G. Fichte argued in 1795 that a woman could be free and independent only as long as she had no husband. Perhaps he opined that a woman might be eligible to rule for office if she promised not to marry, but no rational woman could give such a promise, nor can the state rationally accept it. For woman is destined to love, and when she loves, it is her duty to marry. Early feminism, man. But, like, not really. But, like, early feminism.
I'm loving that Rousseau view. Yeah, that's progress, question mark. Yeah, it's like, well, women have all these silly emotions, and they are drawn to care about men and subject themselves to men. And maybe if they don't, they could be as good as men, but they never will, so sucks.
That's a great way of putting it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is totally off subject, but something that I really don't like about this book is, like I said in the first episode, she kind of jumps through wormholes, and I don't know if that makes sense, but like she jumps through wormholes of time. In about 5 pages, she moves from the 1700s to the early 1900s.
She's found the secret to time travel.
Yeah, she has. In 5 pages, she's done that. And it's very confusing. So she moves from early feminism into the early concept of breadwinners. And you think, okay, well, when did that come about? Well, it did come about in about the 1790s.
What?
Yes. And you think, how is that possible? As the division between a husband's wage-earning activities and a wife's household activities grew, so too did the sense that men and women lived in different spheres. Okay. With a man's sphere divorced from domesticity. Wow, I can't read right now. Is that the correct word? How do you say that?
Domestic life.
Domesticity.
Yeah.
And the woman's divorce from the economy. A historian of the German Enlightenment writes that in earlier countries, when economic production was still centered in the households, domesticity was a virtue shared by males and females, a shorthand term for thrift, hard work, and order. Advice books in the late 17th century still urge husbands as well as wives to practice domesticity. But a century later, domesticity had tumbled out of the constellation of masculine virtues. At the same time, women's traditional tasks, growing food for the family table, tending animals, dairying, cooking, repairing household implements, and making clothes, through a no less burdensome, were no longer viewed as economic activities. In the older definition of housekeeping, women's labor was recognized as a vital contribution to the family's economic survival. Wives were regularly referred to as helpsmeets and yokemates, but as housekeeping became homemaking, it became seen as an act of love rather than a contribution to survival. For all its value within households, wrote American historian Catherine Kelly, women's labor was radically undervalued in the world of cash transactions. Homemakers, now cut off from the sphere of the cash economy, became more dominant on their husbands financially. Women diaries in the early 19th century reflect a new self-doubt about the worth of their contribution to the household economy, even while recording their huge amounts of unpaid work tending livestock, carding wool, sewing clothes, churning butter, hauling wood, cooking, and putting up preserves. While the new division of labor stripped many women of their identities as economic producers and family co-providers, it also freed them from their strict hierarchy that had governed the old household workplace, where the husband had been the boss of his family's economic activities. These economic changes interacting with Enlightenment ideology shifted the basis of marriage from sharing tasks to sharing feelings. The older view that wives and husbands were workmates gave way to idea that they were soulmates. No longer was the exclusion of women from political and economic power explained in terms of male power or privilege, as to be frankly admitted in the past. Many men and women came to believe that wives should remain at home, not because men had the right to dominate them, but because home was a sanctuary to which women should be sheltered from the turmoil of economic and political life. Conversely, the domestic sphere became a place where husbands could escape the materialistic preoccupations of the workday world of wages.
How convenient. Ladies, the world's scary out there. People want to put their penises in you. Some ladies might also be attracted to you. So stay home, don't come out, put a pillow over your head if anything scares you, take care of the house, and I'll give you a weekly allowance if you do all that.
I think
probably
that
not the weekly allowance.
The main point of that entire piece of the book that I read was the fact that it stripped them of their identities because they weren't a part of the economy anymore. So it's like literally capitalism within the home, and they feel like they're not doing anything because they're not earning money.
Yeah, I think it's interesting where you were talking in the first part of this this two-part episode about how women's contributions were valued, and that's one of the reasons you'd marry them, was so they could help out around the household and contribute. And it's interesting that when you start getting into this era of industry and commerce and the first early economics writers who are talking about, how societies function and how like economies are built, that suddenly their contributions sort of vanish from view. And I think one thing that I notice all the time working with data is there's a lot of people who think that if the data doesn't exist, that thing doesn't exist. And they only make decisions based off of the spreadsheets and the information they see in front of them. And in reality, we capture a huge amount of information on all variety of subjects every day around the world, but that's not a complete picture of the world, right? It's one representation. It's one slice of a very complicated, existence, a very complicated universe in which we live. And in the same way, these early economists were probably looking and they were like, well, what generates value? Industry. Well, I can measure industry, right? I can say it takes 5 workers to make, 50 widgets, and those 50 widgets each sell for $10, so I can say these workers produce, X amount of value, right? And they can start measuring that and substantiating it, coming up with charts and ways of calculating all of that. But when you look at, like, home life, it's much harder. Like, what does it mean to say, one woman cleans one house a day? Like, houses vary in size. Like, how do you measure their labor? How do you say, well, a woman is raising their kid, right? Because, one woman might be teaching their kid how to read and write. Another woman might be, just letting them play in the mud or whatever. And so it's difficult to compare those things. Not impossible, right? You can say, a woman taking care of their kid is similar to, a woman being paid to do childcare for a child. And, I think I read some stat that, like, the total value of childcare and, like, home cleaning done by women each year is $10 trillion, which is a significant portion of global GDP. But again, like, it's harder to measure, and so I imagine a lot of people just didn't bother with it. And so I can't help but think that probably played a role where people were like, oh, well, I'm not contributing anything because the economists don't care about me, because the people keeping track of the economy don't think that my contributions are important, even though historically they had been valued very highly.
Well, I just don't like how that's reflected into modern day marriage or modern day relationships. Like, a man can or a woman can go out and they will come home and they'll be like, oh, well, you obviously didn't do anything all day except for sit on your ass and eat bonbons and watch The View. You know what I mean? And they'll come home to a clean house and food on the table and their child is, still alive at the bare minimum. You know what I mean? Like, it's frustrating to see the fact that all of these things go unnoticed now because of this sense of separating the economy from home life.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting too, because I'm of the belief that if you're doing your job right, people probably won't notice your contribution.
Yeah.
Right? If you're part of an organization and you're doing, billing or something, and there's never any problems with the billing, that probably means you're doing a good job and, taking care of what needs to be done. But a lot of people will be like, oh, I never hear anything from your department. I don't, know what invoices you're sending out. I'm going to, spend more time looking at you, or maybe you don't have enough work, which is why, I never hear anything from your department. I'm going to give you more responsibilities rather than take away some and allow you to focus on the good work you're doing already. And so in the same way, I think, if someone expects a clean house and their house is always clean, they might just assume, oh, the house stays clean, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't take a lot of work to keep this, in order. It doesn't take a lot of work to keep the kids alive and healthy and, putting up with their incessant screeching all day. But it does. It certainly does. And it's because the people are managing it so well that it's not noticed. Yeah. So what I'm saying is capitalism ruins everything.
Yeah.
Prior to the birth of industry, it seems women's contributions were valued higher. Maybe not them as people, but it was recognized that they did a lot, and it was respected, and then it all went away.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm forgetting the names of all economists. Who's the guy who wrote the book about the thing?
I took economics 11th grade.
The guy who's like building nails.
It's like that 4 or 5 years ago, Joel.
It's been longer for me, so I have more of an excuse.
Okay.
Keep going.
So I talked earlier about this sense of purity culture that came out of the evolution of marriage, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. It wasn't only women that were affected by this, men were affected by this as well, but once the concept of female purity was established, and was vouched for in the medical profession, women gained the moral right to say no to sex even more, and husbands continue to have legal control over their bodies. Furthermore, the cult of women purity was not, as a modern cynic might initially assume, a one-way street. Men were called upon to emulate this purity themselves. Although they were thought to have strong sexual urges, these were seen as unfortunate impulses that had to be controlled. And oh, this is going to be an ugly sound that comes up on the podcast. This is going to be ugly. Ew. Controlled and repressed. Advice writers insisted that even within a marriage, men must not give way to unbridled exercise of their animal passions. Many 19th century medical and religious authorities warned that having sex as often as once a week could make a man a slave to his sexual passions. The best-selling author Sylvester Graham cautioned his readers in 1833 that the mere fact that a man is married to one woman is perfectly continent to her will not, and is perfectly continent to her, will by no means, no, it's continent, will by no means prevent the evils which flows from sexual excess if his commerce with her exceeds the bounds of a connubial chastity. Don't know what that means. Sylvester calculated that as a general rule, it may be said to a healthy and robust, it were better for you not to exceed the frequency of your indulgence and the number of months in the year.
I'm picturing an old-timey British gentleman at a prep school turning a chair around and being like, now fellas, your dick is like a stick of chewing gum, and you use it too much, it's going to be like a used piece of chewing gum. Now, you offer that to some lady. You think that lady's going to want that used piece of chewing gum? No, she wants a fresh stick. I'm
just imagining that, but I'm also imagining, what he said, that you shouldn't have, not to exceed the frequency of your indulgences, the number of months in a year. So, number of indulgences. So, you can have 11 cigarettes a year.
Yes.
But not 12.
Well, it's not to exceed the number of months in the year.
Yeah, so you can have... Oh, so you could have 12, but you can have 13.
You have 12. Uh-huh.
Oh, okay.
Every 30 days, Naomi.
Yeah.
Put it on the calendar.
Yeah.
Bang day.
1 cigarette a year. Or a month. 19th century letters and diaries testify that many men were extremely uncomfortable with their sexual urges and struggled mightily in their control of them. Although many turned to prostitutes for sexual relief, they could not ask of their sweethearts. It was often more with intense guilt. Others begged their loved ones for help in resisting temptations. Help me fight myself, my worst self that has so long had the mastery, wrote one of his to his betrothed. Another declared to his beloved, you are the very incarnation of purity to me, and you shall help to cleanse me. I'm reminded of these TikToks that I see every so often on social media of these women and men that are how we kept pure in our relationship before we got married. And it's
prostitutes.
And it's we didn't do more than like kiss each other, like peck each other, you know what I mean? Or we didn't do anything more than like hug each other. We never got change in front of each other. We never spent time alone in a room together. And I'm like, then how do you know that you actually like this person? Like, I'm just so confused.
Because I want to have sex with them.
I just don't understand.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I've read a couple of books, a lot of queer theory stuff where there's just these, some explicit, some not so much, letters from people confessing their feelings, sometimes to people who reciprocate in kind to people of the same sex. And so, you have men confessing their heartfelt feelings to other men and women confessing their heartfelt feelings and urges to other women. And the point, of all these books is to collect evidence that, oh yeah, gay people have been around for a while and there's significant evidence to support that fact and it seems pretty normal. And now I'm almost wondering if, like, part of the reason that, like, being gay was shunned was it was like, well, you're supposed to have urges for like sexual reproduction and you're not supposed to have too much of those urges, but now you're urging for people who aren't like the same sex as you, so you can't sexually reproduce, but also you're lusting after them, so it's like double bad. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, like, if heterosexual people doing what heterosexual people want is considered bad, I can't imagine how bad it would be to be like, I'm gay and also want to have sex, and it won't build more children to be used by an industry.
Well, now that sex became, like, during this time period became such like a centerpiece of conversation, even though it wasn't talked about, you know what I mean? So, like, it became the center of everyone's thought, but it wasn't talked about and it was kind of shunned. The age of consent went up in a lot of different areas around the world, which meant less marriage. So that is contributing to the crisis on marriage, quote unquote, that this woman talks about. So your age of consent went up during the economic boom during after World War II. Actually, after World War I and after World War II. So you had a lot of like child slavery. Because you were putting them into sweatshops and things of that sort, and it's now against the law to have children working when they should be in school. But during those times, they were working in warehouses and things to produce more things.
It wasn't slavery; it was slavery with extra steps. Capitalism. Look, children have tiny fingers, perfect for weaving. Like I'm not for child sweatshops. I'm just saying there are certain textiles that can only be produced by children.
And because of the age of consent going up, the number of marriages went down.
You know how like ivory is illegal?
Yeah.
Do you think there's people who have like child-made textiles that there's like an illegal trade in, and they're like, I only wear like the finest of textiles made with little fingers.
Is this like 101 Dalmatians?
Yes, it's exactly like that.
Yeah.
This is another movie idea.
Okay.
Yes,
No.
The world's largest collection of child-made clothing. And it's a heist film.
So, I just want to kind of wrap up in a long sense the whole point of this marriage, or the whole point of this. Whoa.
I'm gonna wrap up this episode.
Talking about why this woman thinks that marriage is in crisis right now. What are her predictions on why marriage is in crisis? So Joel, what are your predictions on why marriage is in crisis?
I thought we discussed them at the beginning of part 1.
But why nowadays, based off of
everything she said?
Yes.
Are we going to talk about the birth control pill?
I would like to talk about the birth control pill, but that kind of plays into other things. You weren't supposed to say anything about the birth control pill.
I assume that was coming, given that's kind of modern history. Based on what you're saying, marriage used to be for economic reasons, to help around the household, or to build alliances. And over time, it kind of lost that. And for some reason, because women were discouraged from having sex, and then men felt the need to be pure as well, people were having less sex. And so a lot of the reason people got married or got together kind of started to fade away. And I think we've discussed this on our episodes before, where it used to be, and we talked about this in part one, it used to be in order to survive, you needed to be working in a community with other people. And if that's no longer the case, and it's no longer the case that sex is okay under that model from like the 1920s, 1910s, then why would you even get married in the first place? Right? You're not supposed to have sex. You're not supposed to like having sex. There's no benefit to getting married because your economic contributions don't mean anything. Yeah, it would make sense to me that marriage isn't... unless marriage is completely retooled at some point in the 20th century, it would make sense to me that marriage is on the decline based on the arguments she's made so far.
Yes. So like you mentioned, marriage was originally based around economic status and for reasons of survival. And then it moved into consolidating assets, and then it's moved into love. So when these people around this time, and I'm talking about specifically around the 17, 18, 19, not even the 1900s, the 17, 1800s, we're talking marriage is centered around love. There's no sort of marriage without love. It was about... if it wasn't about love, it was, oh, I'm going to marry this person because he's old and he's going to die soon, and I want all of his wealth. But of course, these women could not inherit the wealth because they had no sense of having personal bank accounts because equality. So the sense of love in marriage came a lot from the Victorian marriage era, and this book quotes, despite the stilted language of the era, Victorian marriage harbored all the hopes for romantic love, intimacy, and personal fulfillment, mutual happiness that were expressed more openly and urgently during the early 20th century. But these hopes for love and intimacy were continually frustrated by the rigidity of the 19th century gender roles. The people who took idealization of love and intimacy to new heights during the 19th century did not intend to shake up marriage or unleash the new preoccupation for sexual gratification. They meant to strengthen the marriage by encouraging husbands and wives to weave new emotional bonds. In the long run, however, they weakened it. The focus on romantic love eventually undercut the doctrine first of separate spheres for men and women, and the ideal of female purity, putting new strains on the institution of marriage. So that's the first thing, is that love is now the center of marriage, and so less people are getting married because they're not finding love, and they're not finding this idealistic view of love that they want in order to feel like they should get married. The next thing is birth control. And you say, why does birth control play a role in marriage? Well, let me tell you, if women can have sex and there's no sense of, oh, I might get pregnant by him, so I must marry him, or every time that I have sex, I'm thinking about getting pregnant, and that the person I'm having sex with could get me pregnant, I might have to marry that person. Sex became more of an open conversation. So 92% of American females, 92% of American college females, wow, I finally got it right, surveyed in the 1920s reported engaging in petting, fondling body parts below the neck. Historians estimate that at least 1/3 and probably closer to a half of women between the ages who came of age in the 1920s had sex before marriage, twice the rate of premarital intercourse reported by the generation immediately preceding them. By the time young middle-class men were more likely to lose their virginity with women of their own class than with prostitutes. That was not around the time of birth control, but I just wanted to say that because our grandmother grew up in the 1920s.
Okay. So what's the comparison to the 1960s and 70s?
You know how I said that she doesn't give a lot of data about a lot of things that we
Why would you bring
about?
up that stat, be like, oh, birth control changed the way people have sex, and then not contrast that with, and by the way, 3/4 of people before they got married in the 1970s were having sex? That seems like a pretty obvious comparison to make.
So we talked a lot. We talked about birth control. We talked about love. That's a reason. So the golden age of marriage comes in the 1950s, correct? And
No.
that's... That's what she says.
Oh, okay.
That's what she
that's
says.
when all
Sorry.
the people come back with PTSD from wartime, missing body parts with shrapnel in them, and are like, "I'm gonna settle down and live my happy ever after."
Yeah, but life is good, and there's lots of homes to move into, and people are economically happy, which means they are happy themselves. And
there's economic growth for the white middle class in America. There's opportunities. Things are looking up because we're the only country that wasn't decimated during World War II.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this sense of the golden age of marriage and the golden age of life, essentially. And so now materialism became like a good thing that you wanted to become, that you wanted things. So you saw them on TV. You were like, oh, let me get a new refrigerator for my kitchen because I saw a new one on TV. Let me go get a microwave, things of that sort. And because of that, counseling came about, specifically marriage counseling. And you're thinking, how the hell does that have to do anything with the good life? If people are having good marriages, people are starting good economic stats. So materialism via the TV and other sources of advertising became such an issue in marriages that marriage counseling formed around materialism. And you're thinking, that makes no sense. Well, a wife comes home and a husband comes home from the breadwinning all day, and she says, husband, I want a brand new refrigerator. And he says, I don't think we need one. We have a perfectly good one right there. And she goes, well, I just saw a new one that has storage in the door. And he goes, I still don't think we need a new refrigerator. We have a perfectly good one. It's fine. Marriage counseling came about, and the sense of women are all mad from this want for new materials from seeing them on TV and other advertisements. So marriage counseling boomed in the 1950s and started it's the way the center of not the center of marriages, but this sense of we can go someplace and talk about our marital issues in the 1950s.
See, I'd almost assume it'd be the opposite.
Why?
Where like a man's a man, he makes his money at the plant, and he comes home and he sees a new, fancy car on the radio box or the TV stand, and he's like, oh my God, I want to purchase that new fancy car to make me feel like more of a man. And the wife is like, but honey, the children, they need their milk to drink to get nice and strong. And he's like, screw the milk. The car will make me a man's man and allow me to distract myself from the trauma I experienced in World War II and the trauma I experienced sexually harassing my secretary all day, or whatever they did back in the day.
Are we in an episode of Mad Men?
We should be. That's a good TV series. We'd be so proud to be extras in an episode of Mad Men. The point I'm trying to make is, are you saying that that's why it originated? Because I can imagine that might be the excuse, but I also anticipate that, like, if women were subject to like domestic simplicity in their lives, they might be less willing to ask their husbands for things, or more, to distract themselves from being stuck in the same environment. I don't know.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay.
You said that it is blamed on women. Yes, because a lot of issues in marriage were blamed on women.
Still
so
are.
This moved into the never get married, please. This moved into what we now, it's soon moved into what we know now as modern feminist theory, because everything in marriages was blamed on women, which led to a higher divorce rate in the 60s, 70s, and I think moving into the 80s, and then flattened the curve later on. So,
like COVID, we've eradicated feminist theory.
So I just mentioned a number of things as to why marriage is in crisis now, but let me add a little bit more to that. So we talked about marriage counseling and that which led to divorce rates, a hike in divorce rates. There was birth control coming around, the love being in the center of marriage. Let's talk about a few other things. A rise in women in the workforce. We obviously know that from history. A rise in women in the workforce during World War II. Yes, it caused a big issue. There was now 2 breadwinners in the house. It caused a lot of issues because there was the sense that men had to be the center of the breadwinning. And so there was a number of women that got out of the workforce after World War II, but there was a large number of women of color that stayed in the workforce. There was a large number of women of color that stayed in the workforce after World War II. Obviously, they still weren't being paid the same, but there was a large number of women still in the workforce after World War II.
One thing that I came across when doing research for my college thesis was the theory that women entering the workforce was one of the things that caused significant economic hardship for the nuclear family.
Yeah.
And the idea was there's a limited pool of workers who can get the jobs done in the economy. So let's say you pay, Chet $50,000 a year plus, a gold watch and a promotion, every couple of years in order to get his job done at the plant. And that's because there's a limited number of people who can work at the plant. And so the amount you have to pay in order to get them to do the job is $50,000. But then suddenly women start entering the workforce, and the workforce doesn't effectively double, but the number of able bodies able to do the work goes up. And there's more people competing for approximately the same number of jobs as there used to be. Now, the economy will slowly expand and accommodate the fact that there's now more people who are available to work and new positions will be created and whatnot. At least that's how it should work in theory. But there is this huge crisis for a brief period when women are looking for work, where suddenly wages start to fall because they realize, one, more people are competing for the same jobs, so we don't have to pay as much. And two, women will accept lower pay just because they're happy to get a job in the first place. And, that's part what leads to, pay imbalances between the sexes. So when you have more people competing for the same jobs, you suddenly have this issue where the jobs no longer pay as much, which leads to this issue that you can no longer have a single parent paying for an entire family. And this is where we are now, where in a lot of families, both parents have to work in order to afford things for their kids. It's great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, rise in women in the workforce led to financial independence very late in the 1900s. I hate that I just said 1900. I think it was like 1970 when the credit card was, women were allowed to have their own credit cards and hold their own credit. Rise of women in the workforce, financial independence for women, specifically credit cards. They can hold their own credit. They can purchase their own homes. Sperm banks opened for single women. So if they didn't want to get married, they could have a child with somebody else that they didn't have to raise another, like they could do it with a friend. They could do it with a spouse of the same sex. They could
friends with benefits, or the benefit is a child.
Exactly. They didn't have to have a man as part of their relationship anymore. Marriages were no longer necessary for couples. So now there's this rise in live-in partners that became popularized. We see that a lot today. I know you have a number of friends that are just living together, like long-term living
hanging
together.
out.
Yeah, they're not
sussing out the vibe.
Yeah, they're not necessarily ready for marriage, or if marriage is never going to be on the horizon. And divorce became more socially acceptable. So that is why we have a crisis in marriage. That was a long 2-hour version of why marriage is in crisis. Joel, I don't think there's a point in marrying anymore.
I disagree. I think a lot of our laws are still written to give benefits to people who are married over people who are single. And I think that's bad, but also is something you can exploit. And if anything, get married to people and get all those sweet, sweet tax bonuses. And, that could be the extent of your involvement with that person, just filing taxes together each year. But yeah, I think our society is still a bit biased against single individuals, especially single people who are with a partner but haven't, tied the knot, so to speak. I think there's skepticism among our generation in a lot of marriage practices. Like the very act of spending $100,000 on a wedding seems kind of absurd to a lot of people I've talked to. Weird marriage traditions like tossing the garter or just smashing cake into your partner's face, which can be done cute.
No. It's not tossing the garter. It's the act of going up your spouse's skirt and going, and then pulling it down in front of your in-laws.
Bachelor and bachelorette parties, which still, make an appearance in a lot of movies about the last night of freedom a man has before he's tied down to the old ball and chain.
The main issue that a lot of my friends have said, and I don't necessarily have an issue with it, but like, a lot of my friends say, oh, if you're going to go and get married the next day, why are you going to see somebody else's naked body before, like the night before?
Sure. Well, I'm saying, like, there's a criticism of these things that were culturally acceptable in the 1990s.
Oh, I'm throwing these. These ideas.
And I guess to what your point, all of like the historical reasons that people got married no longer seem to really apply. Like, I'm not saying adoption's the easiest thing, but adoption is an option these days.
Adoption is an option.
Well, you were saying it was illegal for the longest time, and now it's a very difficult process to get through. But you can adopt a child. You don't need to marry anybody.
Yeah.
You don't even need to have a baby. You can just like get another baby, right, from somewhere else.
Yeah.
You can survive for yourself in some areas of the country on a single salary, fewer and fewer every day, but that is an option that didn't exist for a while. You can build relationships and political alliances through networking rather than, having to marry people. The entire time you're talking about like kings and queens getting married in order to like form connections and alliances and consolidate resources, I was thinking of the McDonald's theory of world peace, which is two countries with McDonald's in them have never gone to war with each other. And that's getting increasingly untrue because, well, Russia and Ukraine have McDonald's in them. But the idea is that when economies are tied together closely, like having McDonald's in them, governments have less reasons to attack them. And you can see that in our stock market right now. The oil markets are going crazy because of Russia. And so, like, the longer a war goes on, the more the U.S. economy will be impacted just by simple fact that we're destroying economic producing businesses and resources within either Ukraine or Russia. And that'll have an impact on the American stock market because everything's tied together now in this amazing world of globalization. And so in the same way, it's like, I can imagine getting married to a king or queen is good because it's like, why would you murder this person who's probably related to the person? If you're the king of England and you married some woman from France, why would France want to attack you? Because, their daughter, their former, sister or whatever has gotten married to you. It's creating these alliances where there's a reason that you're not going to attack this other tribe, this other group. You have a connection to them. And I think that ties what we're talking about of like, nomad tribes back in the day getting together and, meeting up and having sex in the bushes or whatever. It's another way of forming alliances and creating trust if you have that, bit of intimacy, that bit of emotional connection. Otherwise, it's much, much harder to trade because you're afraid they're going to stab you as soon as, the goods are out and they know what you have. Marriage, man.
Marriage.
Yeah, I mean, people keep complaining about the decline of marriage, and what they should be complaining about is all the factors that are leading to its decline. Because as I said in part one, I was like, I don't really feel that like marriage is bad per se. I think it's a lot of the things that are tied to it culturally that are problematic. I think the idea of two people having an intense emotional connection and wanting to like continue that for an extended period is kind of cool.
Yeah.
The problem is everyone's like, well, the husband should have control over the wife, and the wife should take care of the children, and the husband should have his job where he bangs his secretary on the desk. All of that other stuff, which is bound up in these cultural ideas about what marriage should be. And again, it's not necessarily that people don't want to get married. It's that people can't get married in a lot of cases just because it's so goddamn expensive, and there's so many things standing in their way.
Yeah.
So why won't no one date these guys? Why won't no one marry these guys?
Okay, we have just flipped. We were at date and now we're at marriage. When did we just flip that?
I was building on the theme.
Maybe
no one wants to date these guys. No one wants to marry these guys, and it's all society.
Yeah, maybe we should change our name for these 2 episodes for like the week, the 2 weeks that they're. Yeah,
I'll see if I can edit that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, that's the reason why we're having a crisis. If anybody has any
marriage crisis on Infinite Worlds.
If anybody has any ideas of how to
Supergirl dies at the end.
If anybody has any ideas of how to deal with this issue, let us know in our Instagram DMs.
What are you talking about? We've discussed ideas. People need higher wages. People need to have belief in the future. People need to not be discouraged by societal expectations.
I just want our fans to contact us,
That's
okay?
True.
I just want to talk with our fans.
Tell us your favorite taco toppings in our comments. Be like birria or fried cactus leaf or tongue.
I don't think birria tacos are topping. I think that's just a type of taco.
Okay, tell us your favorite type of taco in our comment, and whoever's answer we like the most, we'll send merch to. And if
Shrimp. Do
Okay,
I get merch?
I'll send merch to Naomi. Fellers, we appreciate you listening to us. We appreciate you absorbing our content. We do find it weird, though, when there's like 100 views on an episode and no one's commented on this. We're not sure if you're just like passively absorbing this and it's something to do, but we would love to create content that is tailored towards your interests.
Please let us know what you want to hear, because we'll just keep putting
more
out episodes.
More book reports, more Am I
exactly.
the Asshole episodes, more current events episodes. It's all coming down the pipeline. More sex ed episodes that have 10 listeners. It's all going to be going in circles unless you give us feedback. We do appreciate our listeners. We do, but we just remain mystified about why you keep coming back.
Okay. Have a great week.
Don't get married.
Put on a condom.
Eat your broccoli. We have many thanks for the use of our theme music, which is the song Drop by Ketsa. You can find more of their music online at ketsa.uk. You can also find Date These Guys online on Twitter and Instagram at DateTheseGuys or visit datetheseguys.org. If you have questions for the podcast or want to be a wealthy sugar parent, send an email to datetheseguys@gmail.com. If you're looking to make an impact in the world, this show strongly recommends Planned Parenthood, a nonprofit organization that provides reproductive health care in the United States. Planned Parenthood provides birth control, long-acting reversible contraceptive implants, clinical breast examinations, pregnancy screenings, prenatal care, testing and treatment for sexually transmitted infections, and abortions. They also do great work for those who are lower income. 4/5 of their clients are at or below 50% of the federal poverty line. Both Joel and Naomi are monthly donors to Planned Parenthood. We hope you will be too.